Welcome to Halloween in July 2, everybody. The world is clearly not a spooky enough place as of right now, so let's hide in our dark rooms and talk about spooky games while the world is possibly ending outside. Last year, y'all seemed a little upset that of all the spooky games we covered last year, we didn't do Amnesia, and that's understandable. Well, I wasn't gonna fire off all the big guns for the first go-round, so this year we're doing Amnesia, boyos. If some of you younger kiddos don't know about Amnesia, The Dark Descent, it's made by prolific horror game developer Frictional Games, and then there was another game called Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs, which is an actual disaster in which my wife and I had more fun dunking on the game's glitches than actually playing it. But more on that later. Amnesia, The Dark Descent was the vanguard of the horror game revival of the early 2010s that helped tell Resident Evil 4 and Silent Hill that, yes, 4 was amazing and breathed new life into horror games, but we have to dial the action back because we've lost our way. Scary games are supposed to be, scary. Amnesia came around right at the time that organized YouTube content was starting to become a thing, and it became the proper kingmaker of early YouTube gaming channels. Pretty much every big institution on YouTube got their start recording themselves overreacting to Amnesia. Crap, Amnesia started an entire genre of this stuff that came to a head with the Slender Explosion and Outlast that eventually crashed when literally hundreds of Unity Engine Slender clones flooded the market and diluted the idea. But we haven't got to the FNAF part yet. Amnesia was the good stuff when it came out. It's still a really engaging, well put together video game that runs well on modern systems. It's made by one Frictional Games who live over in Sweden. They made their bones with a series called Penumbra, a horror adventure game where they were like, yo, I know that our engine doesn't technically support 3D assets, but we're gonna do that anyway. But Penumbra is going to be another video. Amnesia is a first-person horror game that relies on atmosphere and visual effects to get its spooks, as opposed to overt jump scares. Sure, it's got a couple of those, but it's not the game's bread and butter, despite, what early YouTubers might have led you to believe. By the way, we're still talking about the first game, we're gonna dunk on the second game later. Amnesia: The Dark Descent came onto the scene in late 2010, just in time for Halloween. Frictional had just gotten out of a troubled relationship with Paradox Interactive, which they blamed for the shoddy release of Penumbra's sequel and its expansion 2 years prior, and decided that Amnesia would be a self-published title. You play as Daniel, a young Englishman who's literally afraid of the dark and, as luck would have it, wakes up in a mysterious, poorly lit castle where he has a letter sent to himself telling him to kill one Baron Alexander. His memories are a bit of a mess right now, as the title implies, but he knows that there's certainly something spooky going on. So, about that nyctophobia. That's one of the core mechanics of Amnesia. Being in the dark for too long will begin to cause Daniel to have a mental breakdown. The walls start spinning and undulating, he'll start seeing things like giant roaches and other hallucinations, and some otherwise normal things will start to take an alarming new form. Darkness isn't the only thing that'll erode Daniel's sanity. There's also the sudden collapsing of the rundown castle he's in, getting a look at the monsters that are roaming the halls, or seeing anything that generally might scar you for life IRL. There are two ways to stave off a bad case of the crazies and make it to the end of the game: complete objectives and stay in the light. The former involves a lot of puzzle solving, and the latter is a bit more complicated. You've got an oil lantern and some tinderboxes that you can use to light fixtures around the castle, but they are in very limited supply. Oil runs out fast, and each tinderbox is only good for one use. Tinderboxes are also really small, so you're gonna have to search through desks and in little nooks to find them. And by the way, there's a monster chasing you, and that light you need to stay sane makes it very easy for them to find you. It's not the end of the world if you need to put out your lantern and hide in a dark corner for a bit so that the monster loses your scent, and Daniel's eyes will even adjust to the dark after a bit, which I personally think is one of the coolest things you could do in a video game like this. If it wasn't for your sanity, you could easily just creep through the dark, avoiding monsters for the whole game, but where would the fun be in that? What really sells this little dance between Daniel, the horribly mutated staff of the castle, and the creeping darkness is how awesome the lighting effects in Amnesia are. Like, even for a game of its time, Amnesia has some really cool lighting effects as you creep through the castle. Even the textures and models are nothing to write home about, but games like Amnesia, Fear, or any monster movie worth its runtime knows that you need to see less of the monster to have more of a scare. Amnesia is one of those games where the atmosphere is a much more effective tool of scaring the player than monsters, and there's hardly anything that can be considered a jump scare in-game. Well, there are a couple moments where you'll open a door and oh no, the monster was right there, but the real spooks come from having to creep around a dark castle, wondering if the monster's gonna be around the corner or not, or if it was a good idea to use your last tinderbox earlier. When you aren't running away from body horror Jeeves or literally jumping at shadows, Amnesia is at its core a puzzle adventure game. Most of the objectives are centered around finding a hard-to-see thing so that you can use it to complete some sort of puzzle that will allow you to progress deeper into the mansion. Most of them aren't too obtuse, and the majority of the time-padding BS adventure games used to be so fond of was left in the 90s. There were a couple things that I had to look up because I'm something of a moron, but both times it turned out I just missed a subtle clue and the puzzle itself was pretty easy once I knew what to look for. Any game can do puzzles though. What's really cool about Amnesia's challenges is that they have an awesome physics engine for you to play around with. You can fiddle with, pick up, and throw just about everything you see, and it really feels like the objects have some weight to them. You can have a lot of fun just tossing things around and knocking stuff over, and I almost wish it was possible to deter monsters by throwing chairs and stuff at them, and there are certain scenes where you have to throw stuff in the path of the monster to get away, but I think that being able to like hurl a box at the mutant Jeeves' head and knock him out would take the horror out of the horror game. Amnesia has a lot of nice little things too that really contribute to the game's quality of life. At the start, it tells you how to best enjoy the game in a dark room with a good set of headphones, which is certainly a step up from most games, just asking you to adjust the gamma. There's also an autosave system, which I have to admit is one of the best I've seen in a game. I've never lost any progress between sessions, with the game often plopping me exactly to where I was before I turned it off, and in the event that a monster gets me, I always respawn in just the right spot where I wouldn't be so close to fall back into the monster's clutches, but not so back that I lose progress on a puzzle. And trust me, there have been some unfortunate moments with autosaves really getting me. Speaking of dying, Amnesia has some of the best loading screen tips I've seen. Like, genuinely helpful tips that will, if you take the time to bother to read them, you will never die or lose to the same thing twice. You can tell a lot of love went into this game. When you finally puzzle your way to the end of the game, there's some incentive to play again, as there are multiple endings and a harder difficulty where the monsters bother to do their cardio and sprint training, and they can catch you if you just try to run away from them, so you're actually going to have to hide if you want to get by. If you complete all 3 endings for this game, you can assemble all the little jumbles of letters at the end of the credits, which will let you unpack a secret zip file in the game's install directory that contains all the concept art and lots of cool behind the scenes stuff. Or you could just Google the code. No judgments. My first run of Amnesia took me a little under 8 hours, and I wouldn't be surprised if a subsequent playthrough to unlock different endings would take half of that. But even then, that would be a 16-hour playtime to full completion, which for an adventure horror game is really good, especially at $20. There's also Justine, a 3-bit of DLC that takes just under an hour to complete, but there's no saving, so if a monster gets you at any point or you accidentally whiff a moral choice, you gotta start all over again. And then after that, there's all the custom stories, which are entire games in their own right. There's a lot of lists with all the best custom stories compiled, so rather than rattle them off here, I'm gonna just put a link in the description so you guys can click through on your own time. Alright folks, it's time for the anti-sponsor, the lovely little segment where we talk about a sketchy sponsorship that I have rejected thanks to all of your support at patreon.com/charlatanwonder. This one's gonna be a bit more targeted because this is a scam that is very much angled at middle to small YouTubers. You'll get an email from a very generic named sounding sales representative that is representing some indie company. That name is just so to where if you try to search them, nothing will come up because some different topic will appear. And they're willing to give you a large sum of money, usually between $500 to $1,000, to give a shout out to their product, but they'd like you to try it out first so you can really talk about it. And of course, they don't have an official company website. They sometimes will even send mega links to like downloads where it's not even a press kit, it's just an exe. These are clearly scams, and I'm not blurring out this person's name because this person doesn't exist. If we look up the name, there are a few people on LinkedIn with the same name that look nothing like this person, and then if we blow up their little profile image, which I'm sure they never expected anyone to scrutinize, and do a Google search on it, it's a stock photo. This kind of sketchy stuff is like, I guess they're trying to get like access to your channel or even access to your like OS account, but the point is that don't take these seriously. If it's too good to be true, it likely is, and even if you somehow didn't get your stuff hijacked, these guys aren't gonna pay you. So please, if you are a fellow creator, always do a background check on the people that appear in your inbox, or else you will be very sorry. I know this isn't the most relevant anti-sponsor to everyone here, but I still think I should say it because I know at least a few other YouTubers watch me, and I'd feel terrible if like someone I knew got roped into this, because I know times are tough right now and people are desperate for money. That being said, I do run a Patreon in lieu of taking terrible advertisements like this one and real advertisements. So if you are able to, please consider supporting me at patreon.com/charlatanwonder. And additionally, if you'd like, I do have an affiliate deal with the Humble Store, where if you so desire, you can buy games like Amnesia or anything else in Halloween in July off the Humble Store and support a charity and me, and it costs you exactly nothing extra. All the Humble games will appear on your Steam account or any other service, and there is little to no DRM on these. Now, I think this segment has gone on for long enough, so let's get into the train wreck that is Amnesia, a machine for pigs. A few short years after the release of Amnesia, The Dark Descent, we got the sequel, Amnesia, a machine for pigs. Before we get into the objective mess that a machine for pigs was, we should get into the context of this ill-fated sequel. A Machine for Pigs was published by Frictional Games, but it was created and developed by the Chinese Room. Now, if you don't already know who the Chinese Room are, they're the indie studio behind the ever-controversial Dear Esther, a short story-driven source mod which I personally thought was a nice little distraction that had excellent visual storytelling and narration, but at the time a lot of people refused to acknowledge it and other walking simulators as real video games. Interestingly enough, the Chinese Room had previously made a source mod that has a very similar premise to Amnesia, The Dark Descent, where it's a walking sim where you play as an amnesiac protagonist wandering around a large, poorly lit manor with some sort of monster pursuing him. Although in the Chinese Room's game, the memory problems were from severe alcohol abuse, and the monsters were alcohol-induced hallucinations. Things were pretty heated back then in regards to what is and is not a proper video game, and A Machine for Pigs brought things to a head. When A Machine for Pigs launched, there was considerable backlash against the Chinese Room for turning a lot of people's favorite horror game into a walking simulator. Now, a few years after the fact, I revisited some of these infamous walking simulators, and personally I found them to be pretty good so long as they have a good story and visuals to make the walk through the polygons an enjoyable one. But if it's lacking in that, it's basically a visual novel without your precious 2D girls. A waste of time. Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs is a colossal waste of time. So right off the bat, the gameplay in the sequel to an adventure game is severely lacking. You're almost never in any sort of real danger or even in the same room as any of the monsters. And the few times that the piggies are close enough to get you, they won't unless you're egregiously stupid, because the lantern you have will do this really obvious flicker effect whenever an enemy is about to spawn into the room with you. The puzzles, if you can even call them that, are an insult to your intelligence, and at times it will take less than 10 seconds to solve one of these quote-unquote puzzles, unless they require you to backtrack across a level to go grab a thing you need. But then that's just overt adventure game padding, which I thought we left behind in the previous game. There aren't even any wrong pieces for you to grab by mistake that might slow you down. Heck, it's almost impossible not to find and grab the right thing, since where the first Amnesia had tons of stuff you can pick up and play with and mess around and combine, A Machine for Pigs is the polar opposite. There's almost nothing to interact with in A Machine for Pigs except for the things that you specifically need to interact with in order to solve puzzles and progress in the game. This isn't just with objects too. Any cupboard or drawer that you absolutely do not need to interact with is unopenable, and any door that doesn't lead to a place that you need to go in order to progress the story is literally barred off from you using it. There's like a ton of guns and stuff hanging on the wall that might be handy in bringing down a 300-pound pig man, but nope, you're not allowed to touch them. They're not part of the main quest. You see some boxes that might be a means of getting into the next area if you stack them up? Well, too bad. Please keep your hands and feet inside the ride at all times. The icing on the cake is that the protagonist is no longer afraid of the dark, and it wouldn't matter if they were, because you now have an electric lantern that will run on a battery that can go from the very start of the game all the way to the end credits without faltering if you wanted it to. There is also no more inventory system, since you don't need to worry about tinder boxes, oil, or even your health. You're either dead or you're not dead, and any damage you might have sustained if a pigman somehow manages to get you, but you escape, will just regenerate. With a lack of the inventory screen, there's also no more sanity to keep track of. No more walls undulating when you see something scary, no more visual hallucinations unless they're scripted. Now, as I've said before, I am on the team of walking sims can be games, but let's say if we went to Marvel movie number 3125, where Walt Disney Studios promised you just the right blend of spandex, explosion, and passive progressivism, so long as it can be dubbed over for markets that don't like human rights, but instead we got a romantic comedy where no no one was even flying or anything, you might be a little disappointed and you might feel a little misled. Well, I feel the same way about A Machine for Pigs. I'm okay with walking sims, and so long as they're good. However, I did not intend to purchase an Amnesia sequel, a game that is a horror-themed adventure puzzle game, for a walking simulator. I wanted the horror game. Now, then there's how this game, despite being 3 years newer than Amnesia, objectively looks worse than the first game. Everything is kind of muddy, and sometimes you get these random scan lines on the screen for whatever reason. I have no idea as to why this game looks worse than its predecessor, as the story and new assets aren't exactly things that would take all of 3 years between games to work on, and A Machine for Pigs uses a good number of old assets from the first game in lieu of making their own. It's especially frustrating given the lack of interactivity in A Machine for Pigs, because you'll be seeing a lot of things you used to be able to pick up and throw, but now you aren't even given a prompt to interact with them. Everything is covered in that we don't trust the draw distance fog, and when you look closely at any given asset or texture, you can tell that it isn't exactly the finest in all of 3D modeling. I don't know what exactly happened here, as Dear Esther is a visually stunning game, and the team at the Chinese room had plenty of time to work on new assets, given how long the final product is, which, don't you worry, we'll get into that in a moment, and this all goes doubly so because we're reusing assets from the previous game. I don't know, maybe they were really just trying to dial it in on Everyone's Gone to Rapture, or maybe they were having issues working in the engine and they just weren't quite the wizards that the Frictional Games team was. But I have no clue how what's supposed to be a full-blown sequel looks like it's more of a total conversion mod. Getting into what I was hinting at before, A Machine for Pigs is very much more of a walking simulator than a proper adventure horror game. There are quite a few segments where all you can do is walk, listen to narration, and wait for people to exposit at you. Now, again, I have no idea what was going on behind the scenes, but even during my initial playthrough, the game is only 3.5 hours long, and that's what's in-game padding, which it uses a lot of. Machine for Pigs is a big fan of forcing you only to be able to walk during long hallway segments where there is literally no reason for you not to be able to run, except for that developers didn't know how to pace it right unless the character was moving at a very specific place. It's like, you may as well just keep me on literal rails if you're going to do this. I bet if you were allowed to sprint at all times, A Machine for Pigs would be a 2 hours or less experience. Certain quote-unquote puzzles are repeated in certain places to further pad the time, and unlike the previous game, there is effectively zero replay value, as once you've gotten through the first go-round, there are no alternate paths or different endings to choose from. The worst part about this is the game isn't even that scary. The atmosphere just doesn't do it for me like it did in the last game, and the pigmen aren't even enough of a threat to give you a real spook, and the most the Machine for Pigs tries to do in the supernatural spooks department is the oh so spooky child hallucinations and this pig mask that will occasionally try to pop out of nowhere to jump scare you, but it never hit the mark for me. As I said before, my wife and I got more fun out of memeing on this game than we did playing it. And even then, if all of this wasn't bad enough, there's a general lack of polish around the whole thing. In addition to the sloppy texture work and weird filters over the screen or whatever is causing these scan lines to occur, there's also issues with long load times, regardless of if you've got it on SSD or HDD, or whatever you're packing in the graphics and RAM department. As a point of reference, I did not have any of the problems that I had in A Machine for Pigs with the original game. There's also a lot of little issues that I feel there are no reason for, such as the font Chinese room decided to go with for almost all of the small text in the game that you will need to read to understand the background information is this really weird font that's hard to read. And I don't know, but I can't help but wonder if maybe they didn't have a proper text set for this font, so they had to use a version that didn't scale up or down very well. This ultimately led to me having to read aloud all the journal entries 2 inches from the screen, because even though my wife was only about a short distance, 3 or 4 feet away from the screen while we played, she couldn't read it from where she was with or without glasses. There was also a lot of overly flowery writing in a lot of the text that makes it hard to read, let alone read aloud. I get that this was supposed to be the Victorian era of the United Kingdom, which a lot of people associate with Jules Verne and fancy, stuffy English people, but I'm pretty sure that the prose wasn't this purple back in 1899. And this goes on from the first few levels of the game all the way through to the end credits, where rather than just outright say the roles that all the developers have, they insisted on presenting themselves in the most obnoxious, I never left behind that high school theater kid mentality possible. I get that some folks love to enjoy the theatrics of any sort of productions, video games included, but the end credits are supposed to be the stage vow, where you traditionally finally have your actors and your crew drop their characters or job and present themselves to the audience as they are. In hindsight, everything about A Machine for Pigs did no favors for the negative perception of walking sims and the indie devs who made them at the time as being overly pretentious art pieces, made by people who put on airs and claimed their work was too complex for a rube like you, the confused player wondering why the game they pay good money for is unsatisfying and lacking in basic polish. The early 2010s were full of these types, and while I have no reason to believe the Chinese Room was like this in reality, gamers do love their confirmation bias. So where are they all now? Well, let's start with Frictional Games, who went on to make Soma, another first-person horror adventure game that was well received by critics and got lots of love in the YouTube gaming scene. Until recently, they've been keeping their heads down and working on a new game that, until now, was under wraps, but we'll get to that in just a sec. What about the Chinese Room? Well, they did their own standalone game that wasn't a source mod or a sequel to someone else's game in Everybody's Gone to Rapture, which got a good smattering of awards upon release, but awards do not necessarily mean big sales. The Chinese Room had to lay off the majority of their staff, but then they were later bought out by a larger company and rehired most of the original team. Presently, they're working on something new and exciting, the last time I checked, but thanks to the big bad Rona, all bets are off on when anything comes out anymore. And that leaves us to the Amnesia series itself. Well, you might have known, clicking on the video, earlier this year, after much teasing and hinting, Amnesia Rebirth was announced and expected to release in late 2020. But again, all bets are off now thanks to the global pandemic. At least, I don't think they have to deal with mass civil unrest over in Sweden, as I'm fairly certain their police force knows that you're not supposed to kill people just because they look different from you. Amnesia Rebirth looks like it's going to be centered around a lady named Tassi sometime in the early 20th century, and as the title would imply, Tassi has no memory of how the heck she got to where she is, or possibly even where she is. Screenshots hint at some pretty sweet lighting effects, and I gotta be honest, while I was initially planning to hold off on buying a new GPU, thanks to the RTX 2000 series having rather disappointing benchmarks outside of ray tracing, I might be tempted to pick up a 2080 Ti on a deep, please buy from us because the pandemic slump is ruining our business discount. But I don't know, if I get to play Amnesia with cool ray tracing effects, I might just pull the trigger. I'd be very pleasantly surprised if it launches in 2020 as intended, with all things considered. And that's gonna do it for this week's spooky video. Make sure to subscribe if you aren't already, because we got 3, maybe even 4 spooky videos in the weeks to come, depending on how many energy drinks I can slurp down before my kidneys give out. We've got Fear, Penumbra, and Outlast on deck, and maybe a few more surprises too. If you're able to do so right now, please consider supporting this channel through patreon.com/charlatanwonder. It's totally cool if you can't though, because times are pretty wild right now and we all need our money. Regardless of your patronage, come on down to the Discord, where we all are welcome to chatting, hanging out, and on Saturday nights like this one, we all play games together just to help pass the time. In the meantime, stay safe, wash your hands, remember your constitutional rights if you're in the United States, and enjoy this cat video. Alright, we got the harness on. Thank God it still fits. Frisk finally had his shots done, and to nobody's surprise, he is the largest he's ever been at 16.4 pounds, and we're gonna have to reduce his diet even more and find a way to resist his screaming at night, because I'm sure I've talked about this before, but he knows that if he just keeps screaming at 3 a.m. he'll get more food, thanks to the fact that we don't have another room to put him in because we live in a rented room. But once he gets used to this harness, we can start the process of going outside for the walkies. He seems to be more interested in murdering it, and I'm glad, like, I put it on and it's not like too tight. Like, I can still, like, the finger rule works where, like, it's loose enough to where I can easily slip a finger in and out. I hope it's not so loose that, like, he breaks free, but that's why we're gonna at least try it out in the house a bit. As you can see here, he's like barely wrapped around. You know, we're gonna, oh, see, you're getting the idea. You're getting the idea. I'm not gonna drag you because that would be mean. Come on. You know, what if, just to get used to it, we're gonna take off the leash, or the lead, whatever it's called. And I'm just gonna let you chill like this. I know you hate me, but this is hopefully for your own good.